just want to say right off the bat, I'm not really having a good makeup day today. You know, sometimes we gotta win big and sometimes we gotta lose big, and what we're doing today?
We're losing big.
Hi, hello, how's it going? It's slow. I am a bit breathless, I'm out of breath, it's just too hot to function today. I really don't want to know what summer is going to look like if winter already feels like this. So today we're here to do my August wrap-up. As I've mentioned before in this channel, August was the month of the Latinx readathon, so I made a conscious effort to actually read the majority of the books for the month written by Latinx authors, and it was a pretty good reading month, I have to say. I'm really satisfied with the readings that I had, with a few exceptions, but we're gonna get there. So, the first book that I read in the month of August was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I have a full-length review of this book in my channel, so you can check that out. I'm gonna link it in the cards, I never know where it is. Mexican Gothic is basically a horror story set in 1950s Mexico City and follows Noemi Taboada as she tries to figure out what the fuck is going on with her cousin, because her cousin is sending some weird shit to her and she's like, dude, I gotta see what is going on with her. And when she gets to the house of her cousin's husband, or the family where that she married into, some shit goes down, and that shit has to do with mushrooms. It's a whole trip, a whole ride, but to make a long story very, very short, I absolutely loved Mexican Gothic. I love the themes and the discussions that we can have in this book. I think Silvia Moreno-Garcia's writing is absolutely astonishing good. It's just Silvia Moreno-Garcia's writing is by far and wide one of the best writings that I've had the honor of actually reading this year. She is so spot on with her words, with her writing, with her characterization, with the reference that she uses throughout the book. There were a couple of things in the book that I felt weren't as developed as I wanted them to be, especially considering the themes. But then again, this didn't dampen my enjoyment of the book. It was a really extremely well-written horror. I got the heebie-jeebies. I will never eat a mushroom again in my life. So if you're interested about my full thoughts on Mexican Gothic, again, you can click the card up above where I discuss in depth, like, and go full psychoanalysis bitch in the analysis. The next book that I read was O Essencial da Década de 1970 by author Caio Fernando Abreu. Caio Fernando Abreu is one of my favorite writers in the whole world. And as Brazilian writers go, he comes really close to Clarice Lispector. Like, this is how much I love him and I love his writing. Much more than a writer, he's a historian of Brazilian LGBTQ life and culture throughout the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. The title in Portuguese is O Essencial da Década de 1970. In English, that would be something along the lines of The Essential of the 1970s. And basically, this is a collection of stories, a type of short story that is just particular to Brazilian literature called crônica. That is a very short story, usually talking a little bit about a topic in, you know, politics, which is definitely very relevant in this time period. Also a collection of letters, poetry, just, you know, things that he wrote throughout the 70s that were all collected into this one book, especially with his letters, which are basically my favorite part of all of the anthologies, both 70s, 80s, and 90s, because even his letters are poetical and beautiful in a way. When you read the three anthologies, you get the progression of LGBTQ plus life throughout Brazil in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So in the 1970s, which is this anthology right here, basically it's just the beginning of the military dictatorship in Brazil. This picks up a little bit of the 1960s by the end of the 1960s. So by the end of the 1960s, if you don't know, Brazil was under a military dictatorship. There was a military coup, but the transition into an actual factual military dictatorship came by the end of the 1960s. So in 1967, the military junta in place actually created a new constitution, and then in 1969 that constitution was very heavily amended by something that we call the Institutional Act number 5, or I-5. That Institutional Act instituted actual government censorship. So for you to publish anything, you would have to get, you know, your material and your text, your songs, your theater plays, your soap opera scripts, everything had to go through censorship. All art form in Brazil in that time, and it's basically one of my favorite times of artistic production in Brazil, is made in such a way that they have to evade censorship. So they have to write in a way, and they have to present things in a way that will not alert the censorship that they're actually criticizing the regime and the establishment. Going back to Caio Fernando Abreu now, this is the book where Caio Fernando Abreu really comes into contact with the fact that the things that he wants to say cannot be said in the way that he wants, so he has to find a way to circumvent the military dictatorship and the military censorship. In the beginning of the 70s it's pretty clear, and then as the 70s progressed and the military dictatorship got harder, a couple of his friends were persecuted, a couple of his friends were murdered, he himself was arrested, tortured, and then he went into exile to, he lived in the UK for a while, then he came back, and it's a very tumultuous time in Brazilian politics and in his personal life as he comes to terms with his own sexuality. It's also a very tumultuous time. So this is a very interesting book that talks about a very sort of hopeful idea that none of this actually will last for long. He was a hippie in the beginning of the 70s and he believed in power, flower power, and etc. And this book just chronicles his disbelief that flower power and peace and love and whatever would actually solve the horror that he was seeing in his home country. This is not my favorite anthology by him. My favorite anthology by him is the one that he writes in the 80s. In the 1980s, you know, he came back from the exile. The military dictatorship ended in 1985, and Brazil always had a very flourishing LGBTQ plus life. And the 80s is a very hopeful time for him in the way that he feels like the military dictatorship is over, prejudice is starting to go away, I can finally live a very good life and I can love in the way that I want. And then came the 1990s and he was diagnosed with AIDS, and the 1990s is a very difficult, depressing sort of time in his writing. I could write a whole last essay about Caio Fernando Abreu and the Brazilian 1970s and 1980s and the artistic and literature production and the musical production in those time periods. But let's just say that I gave the Essential of the 1970s a 4 out of 5 stars. The reason why is because he needed to circumvent the censorship, but sometimes he circumvented in a way that I just couldn't understand what he was talking. A lot of what he's writing in this time period is largely experimental, so sometimes it just really misses the mark. And it's interesting because there are some short stories in this collection that have notes by Caio Fernando Abreu, and he himself says, like, I have no clue what I was talking in here, so this was experimental and I'm not really sure what I was going for. So, but yeah, this is actually pretty interesting if you're a Brazilian, or if you read in Portuguese, or if you read in Spanish also. The 1980s collection is my favorite collection of all times. It's just a 5 out of 5. I tabbed like not much in this book, but if I went back to my 1980s copy and just tabbed it, it would be wild. So yeah. Essencial da Década de 70, 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read for the month of August was Undead Girl Gang by Lily Anderson. Undead Girl Gang actually made me realize something about the conversation on critical reading and reading for leisure on BookTube and BookTwitter and the book internet as a whole. And it made it pretty clear that we are missing a great part of this conversation. Let me backtrack. The plot of Undead Girl Gang follows Mila as she's trying to deal with the sudden death of her best friend called Riley. The police ruled Riley's death as a suicide. Mila is very decided to prove that her best friend was murdered, but her parents and the school doesn't really believe her, and basically they just want like her to accept the fact that maybe Riley wasn't telling her everything and maybe that Riley actually committed suicide. So Mila, who is a witch, decides that she will actually raise the dead and that will solve it. But when she does actually raise the dead, not only she accidentally raises up the other 2 girls who were dead the week before Riley died, but none of them actually remember anything. So her plan of actually figuring out who killed them didn't really work at all. And they actually have to work together in a limited time to find out who killed all 3. This book... Okay, so before I actually go down into my thoughts of this book, I actually want to have a quick conversation and bring back this sort of controversy that was around the book internet for a while, that was reading for leisure and reading critically. Lots of people say that sometimes they don't want to read critically and they just want to read for fun, and usually this is the argument that is used to defend pieces of literature that are highly popular but are also very highly problematic. The thing is, reading critically is not the same thing as being critical. When you're reading critically, you're actually evaluating the story for its artistic and literary value. When you're reading something critically, you're looking into the plot structure, the character development, the plot twists in the book. Is the book coherent? Is the plot good and intriguing? Is the writing of good quality? Are we talking about a book that subverts tropes, or are we talking about a book that is cliche? So when we're talking about reading critically, we're always talking about the format of a book. On the other hand, when you're being critical, that means that you as a person are aware of the systematic oppressions that exist and permeate your life and your entire existence. There is not a single moment of your life where you can stop being critical. There is not a single moment of your life where you can turn a blind eye to the oppressions that several people face for many different reasons throughout their entire lives. So if you read a book and you see that there is blatant racism in the book that is not addressed, if you read a book and you see that there's terrible representation, if you read a book and you see that the author is blatantly transphobic, it is your duty as a human being who cares for other human beings to actually point the faults in that, to actually say that this is not right, this is wrong, we cannot treat people like this is unacceptable in a piece of media. And it's a constant work. You don't do that only with books, you do that in your daily life. When your friend is being racist, you call out on him and you say, you're being a racist piece of shit. When your parents are being homophobic, if you are in a position where you can do that, don't put yourself in danger, but if you are in a position where you can do that, you go like, you can say that's homophobic, you educate people around if it's safe for you to do. And I think that sometimes when we say that we would like to read for leisure and not read critically, we're mixing two things that do not go together. There's absolutely nothing wrong in reading a book and overlooking all of the problems in plot, character development, and writing because you felt enchanted by the story and because you like the universe. That is a-okay. When sometimes people are like, oh, I just want to read for fun, I don't want to read critically, what they mean is that they don't want to look at oppression and they don't want to point it out and they don't want to be in the uncomfortable position of calling it out. When in truth, what we should be saying is you don't have to read critically. You don't have to look at a work and evaluate for, objective points like character development and plot structure and the quality of the writing. You can read for fun, but you can never stop being a critical person. If you want to be a good person, that is. I mean, if you want to condone racism. Why did I go off in this tangent? Because Undead Girl Gang made me realize exactly the difference between being a critical person and reading critically. Undead Girl Gang has severe plot problems. Again, spoiler alerts, but I feel like the plot twist and the villain and all of that just felt really rushed. There was absolutely no build-up or no foreshadowing in a way for the villain to appear. It made absolutely no sense. The reasoning behind the villain's actions were also very, flimsy. The characters sometimes felt a little cartoonish. So objectively speaking, Undead Girl Gang is either a 2.5 or a 3 stars if I'm being generous. That being said, I will insert a clip of my reaction to Undead Girl Gang.
My hair looks a mess. I look a mess. It is 2:30 in the morning. I am just done with Undead Girl Gang. I have a couple issues with the plot. It's kind of like all over the place, but I can't stop crying about this stupid book. This is absolutely humiliating. I have therapy in like 5 hours and I can't sleep because I keep crying thinking about the fact that my best friend will one day die and I might survive her. This is ridiculous.
This is why I was talking about reading critically and reading for fun. Undead Girl Gang is a book that has serious plot problems, but I was so invested in Mila and Riley's relationship as best friends because I feel like that taught to me and spoke to me of something that for me is so dear and near to my heart. My best friend, Sophia, she's a doctor, and right at the beginning of the COVID crisis, we actually had a very serious and very earnest and very humorous, but at the same time very poignant conversation about what was I supposed to do if she died fighting COVID. And I feel like in the book, because Riley and Mila have such a short amount of time, the fact that they're able to say a last goodbye and allow Riley to actually have a good death. And all of you know like how the good death is something that is very close to me and something that I really love. Mila was also able to come to terms with the fact that Riley wasn't coming back, and they were able to have this final goodbye in a way that was so touching. Like I was saying, Undead Girl Gang just made me feel things. I was not expecting it to evoke the emotions that it did. I think that I don't know, maybe I was PMSing or whatever, but I just felt that it evoked something so beautiful and a deeper appreciation for the best friend that I do have, and how lucky I am for the fact that we can have honest conversations about death and we can actually go and talk about things that are so earnest. I wish the book actually discussed the idea of death and the finality of it, and how, you know, Mila could have been just in denial about that death and its reality, which she is, but that isn't really the focus of the story. And I wish it was, because if it was, it would be so beautiful. It would be an incredibly death positive story. And you know, but as it was, to sum up all of this rambling, I gave Undead Girl Gang 4 out of 5 stars because of my sheer enjoyment of it and because it just evoked such a visceral reaction out of me. And I think that when we're talking about reading critically or reading for fun, this is what we're talking about. This is a book that I'm very much aware that has many structural problems, but is a book that evoked something really beautiful out of me, and I really loved it. But at the same time, this is not a problematic book. There are no problems that I can see. The representation is super good. You know, sometimes authors have limitations on their writing, but as a whole, this was a great experience. The next book that I read for the month of August was Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. I mentioned this one in my July wrap-up, and I mentioned that I was rereading it, so I finished my rereading with an excessive amount of tabs. This book is so good. This book is like, I don't know if you can see it, but I annotated like the ever-living shit out of this book. If you haven't seen my July wrap-up, basically Caliban and the Bitch. If you haven't seen my July wrap-up, basically Caliban and the Witch talks about women in primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is what socialists and Marxists will call the first taking of private property that will actually create the accumulation of capitalism in the future. Basically what she argues here, and the argument that she makes, is that the witch hunts in medieval Europe weren't just, you know, the dying breath of an incredibly superstitious society. They were actually the necessary first step for capitalism as an organized system of production to emerge, and that the processes of witch burning are very similar to other processes of subjugation of people throughout the world. And she talks a lot about colonialism in here, a lot about slavery too. This book is incredibly interesting. I am planning a full review on it, just so I can actually discuss the topics that Silvia Federici talks a lot better. But this was one of the best academic reads for me of the year. And dude, this edition though, look at the chapter pages. This book is insane. Dude, what the fuck? This book is gorgeous, this reading was amazing, and this book got 5 out of 5 stars for me. The next book that I read was a very short but impactful read, and that's 100 Love Sonnets by Pablo Neruda. This was a reread for me. I just annotated the ever-living shit out of it. Basically, these are 100 sonnets that Pablo Neruda wrote for his wife, Matilde, and it's divided into morning, evening, and night. It's just amazing. It's just so cute and lovely, and just like, you know, Matilda was out there getting 100 love sonnets and I never even got a flowers. And you know, like I said, sometimes we win big and sometimes we lose big, and what are we doing? We're losing big. So I gave 100 love sonnets 5 out of 5 stars. Next. The next book that I read for the month of August was The Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. This book made me wish I was Jared 19. I hate it. I hate this book. This book is complete garbage. Maybe one day I'll make a full review of it, and I don't want to be cancelled because I know too many people love Sarah J. Maas, but this was the worst piece of work I've read this year by far, and I've read some shit. I read that one Haunted Vagina book, and I will say the author of the Haunted Vagina has more logic than the author of Throne of Glass. Right at the beginning of the book, Selena is talking about how she almost evaded Endovier. She is kind of like bragging that she almost escaped Endovier once. And then there was this one part that is just, Selena seethed. So, do you know how far the wall is from the mines? He gave her a blank look. She closed her eyes and sighed dramatically. From my shaft, it was 363 feet. I had someone measure. Who measured? Who measured? You're a fucking slave in a salt mine. Who measured that for you? Did you bribe a guard? With what? Did you have money? You didn't. Who measured that fuck with? Who measured that distance for you? Who did you ask? You're a fucking slave. White people have no grasp on the concept of slavery at all. White people have no idea what slavery is, because who the fuck measured that for you, Selena? This book has absolutely no grasp on basic logic whatsoever. Selena is a piece of shit. I hate her. She is like the worst main character I ever had the displeasure of reading in my entire life. She's a little shit, and she's like the epitome of not like other girls. This book was a not good time. I am all for hate reading shit. This was beyond my hate reading abilities. I just hate it. I think I broke my Kindle in my rage. I did not. I would kind of wish I had, because then I would never ever have to look at those words again. Anyway, I hated Throne of Glass. I gave it 1 out of 5 stars. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Let's go to the next book. The next book that I read was The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector. The Hour of the Star is one of my favorite books of all times. I love The Hour of the Star. I love Clarice Lispector, and I feel like The Hour of the Star is where her ability as a writer really reached its peak. Every time that I reread The Hour of the Star, I understand more about it, and I understand more about the characters and what she was trying to make and create. But, however, this was the first time that I actually read the translation, and I read specifically the Benjamin Moser translation of the book. As I said in my vlog, I have a lot of issues with the translation. I feel like Benjamin Moser didn't really quite understand what Clarice Lispector was trying to say, and it's things like, there's this one part right at the beginning of the book where Clarice Lispector lists 13 titles for alternative titles for the book. And one of the titles in Portuguese is O Direito ao Grito. And in the Benjamin Moser translation, that got translated as The Right to Shout. And that just completely misses all of the nuance in the book. Because when she says O Direito ao Grito, she's not just saying that she wants to shout. It's like the right to protest, the right to scream, the right to feel rage. It's different. And right off the bat, Clarice Lispector is a very difficult author to translate, but I feel like the Benjamin Moser translation actually tried to water it down so it would be like sell it better to English-speaking audiences. Sophia, my best friend, she said that Latin American books, they aren't translated into English, they are gentrified into English, and I thought that that was such an apt description, because I feel like the Benjamin Moser translation of The Hour of the Star really got, it was just gentrified. It was a watered down version of the poignancy of this book. In the end, I gave The Hour of the Star 5 out of 5 stars again, but I would have to make the addendum that this translation by Benjamin Moser, which I think is the most available one, is definitely not the best that this book is, and I feel like this could draw people away from the book because it lacks a lot of the nuance and the subtlety, and I fear that sometimes, you know, some things just get lost in translation, which is a pity, because sometimes I want to read things and they are translated, and I know that I'm missing a lot of subtext and I can't speak all the languages that I want to speak, and sometimes I just have to rely on translations, and it's just like Anyway, the next book that I read was also a reread, was The Powers of Horror by Julia Kristeva. This book is a trip. It's a wild ride. As I've explained a little bit in my Mexican Gothic review, basically Julia Kristeva is a psychoanalyst, and she has this idea of abjection. What she says is that we are a person, a personality, a whole subject, but outside of this subjectivity, outside of our own egos, there is something that is called abjection. And she says that there looms something called abjection, and that it tempts desire, and it can never really be truly eradicated. And she says that everything that we feel as humans that evoke feelings of disgust, horror, fear, and are things that kind of like remind us of our own shortcomings as humans, but also things that remind us of how fleeting and fragile our own sense of identity is. That was incredibly important and resourceful for my thesis. It fits so well with Silvia Federici and other works that I've read this year, but also on its own, it's an incredible tool to analyze horror and, you know, fear, disgust, and things that kind of like remind us of how fleeting we are as humans, how fragile we are as humans, and how our own sense of identity can always be disturbed, which is like the root of horror to begin with. So this is an incredible book. If you like horror, this is a difficult book. This is a very, very difficult book. It's probably one of the hardest books that I've read this year, but if you're interested in horror, and if you're interested in analyzing horror in an academic capacity, I would definitely strongly, highly recommend Julia Kristeva's work. It's incredible, especially the first 3 chapters, I feel, are very informative and just give a lot of food for thought. So yeah, I give The Powers of Horror 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. I listened to this book on audiobook, and it was the best choice I could have made. Elizabeth Acevedo narrates this book herself. I know that I'm late to the hype, but Elizabeth Acevedo owns my left butt cheek now. I have absolutely no words for the experience that The Poet X was. I am going to read all of her other books because this was the closest to a spiritual experience as I've ever gotten with the book. I just cannot explain enough how much The Poet X has impacted me. The story and the depth of it, and you know how she worked words, and the fact that it deals with slam poetry also. It's just written in such a way, because I love slam poetry. I adore slam poetry, and Elizabeth Acevedo got that nailed down to a T. And the confrontation that she has with her mother, her relationship with her mother, how that got resolved, and you know the climax of the book when her mother finds her poetry journal. It's just, I honestly cannot explain to any of you how much I absolutely adore The Poet X. It had no business being as short as was. The part where she talks about the church, the part where she talks about if Medusa was Dominican, and the part where she talks about her name being the name of a warrior, and then people would get angry at her for actually taking up on what her name gave her. And that just, you know, it's so personal to me because my name actually also means famous warrior for some reason. I just connected with Xiomara so much in such a deep level. And I am a hole for Elizabeth Acevedo. We found out a new favorite writer. What else can I say? What else can I say that hasn't been said yet? I love The Poet X. I love The Poet X. 5 out of 5 stars. Amazing. The next book that I read for the month of August was The Aleph by Jorge Luis Borges. This is a short story collection all about magical realism and also just magical shit. I mean, the problem with short stories collections is that sometimes not all of them hit the mark. And I feel like this was unfortunately the case with The Aleph. I was so hyped up for this book. But here's the thing, going back a little bit on reading for leisure and reading critically, this is a book that I did not enjoy reading, but this book has an objective quality to it in the writing style that is just undeniable. So that weighed a little bit because I read this more as a classic that I thought was important to get my hands around and to really read and understand the themes and understand the writing. Borges is an incredible writer, but not all of the stories really made me feel things, you know? There are only really 2 stories in this book that I actually like. The first one is the actual first story in this book is called The Immortals, and the second is, and it's one of my absolute favorite short stories of all time. It's The House of Asterion. And because I loved The House of Asterion so much, I thought that The Aleph was going to be a huge plus for me, and unfortunately it wasn't. The other stories were kind of like, So it wasn't a bad reading experience, it was just I love The House of Asterion so much that I actually expected more out of The Aleph. For those of you who don't know, The House of Asterion is basically a retelling of the Minotaur story, but on the perspective and the point of view of the Minotaur. So in the Minotaur's mind, he's doing the right thing. He's doing what he needs to be doing, and he's a highly intelligent person, but he's doing what he needs to be doing. But he's also a fated creature, so he's also awaiting for his fate in that labyrinth. And you know, it's a very, very short story. It's available online if you are interested. I bought the Aleph because of the House of Asterion, and I would not recommend doing that. But this is a book with a very high quality of writing, so I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. The last book that I read for the month of August was Ponciá, Vicêncio by Conceição Evaristo. This book is very strange. This is a book that I really don't know how to talk about it. This book is haunting. And basically this follows this young girl called Ponciá, and her grandfather was, they say that her grandfather was insane. He lost his mind because of slavery. He was a slave. As she was born, people said that she would actually carry the inheritance of her grandfather, and the inheritance would be remembering, and basically remembering everything that they have gone through, and she has gone through as a black woman in a newly freed from slavery Brazil. Slavery of black people all over the Americas was bad, and I'm not saying that it wasn't, but slavery in Brazil was a particularly brutal sort of piece of history. And Brazil was so dependent upon slave labor that it was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888. And the story of Ponciá Vicêncio kind of follows this girl who is condemned to remember, and she has to remember the violence, and she has to remember the suffering and the pain. That reminded me a lot of that one story, The Deep, which is something that I'm really interested in reading this month, because it's also about remembering the horrific things that I have gone through, and because like the weight of this. But Ponciá Vicêncio is told in a way that is very difficult to explain. I don't know how the translation of this goes, because this is so specific to a certain specific place and time in Brazil. I don't know, I just kept thinking about this book for a very long time, and I gave Ponciá Vicêncio 4 out of 5 stars. It's undeniable that the quality of the writing is there. A little bit of it was missing on me, but this book haunted me. Anyway, this was my August wrap-up. I had a grand old decolonial time. I had a lot of fun. It was very fun reading only Latinx books, throwing a glass aside because, God. Yeah, I was pretty happy with the readings that I had. Yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!